Hello again guys, and welcome back to another installment of Trey the Explainer. Today we have another religious history biblical text examination episode where I look at things referenced in the Bible and take a more in-depth look at them in an attempt to find their significance and meaning in their original and intended context. This will be very similar to my last religion video where I discussed the biblical sea monster, the Leviathan. Check out that video if you haven't. Today, I've set out to discuss perhaps the strangest and most perplexing of the beings referenced in the Bible. Odds are most of you have at the very least heard of the word Nephilim or Nephilim, as on the internet they appear to be a good way of attracting some, let's politely say, interesting people with out-of-the-ordinary beliefs and theories. My Giants video garnered the attention of such people, and oh boy, everybody seems to have their own theory on what the Nephilim are, from dinosaurs to giant, violent, dinosaur-fighting humanoids as depicted by my buddy Ken Ham, to fallen angels trapped as rock monsters as the 2014 film Noah depicts, to the hybrid offspring of humans and angels or demons, to, of course, aliens. Yes, I've heard people claim all kinds of things about the Nephilim, and it seems like a lot of people, namely religious ones, mainly Christians, have questions about them, and perhaps this is justified, and to be expected from their obscurity, and the in-passing nature in which they're referenced in the Bible. The Nephilim are only mentioned 2 to maybe 3 times in the entire Bible, the 2 undisputed ones coming from the Pentateuch, or the first 5 books. And like the Leviathan and Behemoth, these references are incredibly brief and in passing, as if the audience should already kind of know what they are, and I bet this is why many have left from reading about them in the Bible unsatisfied and hankering for some rather outlandish answers and conclusions. So, in this video, I will attempt to examine the significance and meaning of the Nephilim, and by proxy, the sons of God mentioned in the Old Testament, in the original ancient context the authors of the Bible intended. The Nephilim. To start our deconstruction, let's first examine the word Nephilim or Nephilim itself. Some versions of the Bible simply translate the word as giants, but in actuality the Hebrew word Nephilim literally translates to the fallen ones. Now, the fallen meaning to their name has caused some to believe the Nephilim are fallen angels or demons from heaven. However, this interpretation is likely wrong. Modern biblical scholars understand that the specific word used is intended to mean fallen in death, mainly associated with the heroic death of a great warrior. The verb derivative of the word is commonly used to describe the deaths of individuals, specifically warriors, such as in David's lament over the death of Saul and Jonathan, how the warriors are fallen. So a better translation would maybe be the killed ones or the slain ones, and this significance to their name makes sense in accordance to some of the verses in which they are mentioned. Now to the Nephilim's actual appearance in the Bible. The Nephilim show up extremely scantly. Their first mention is in Genesis 6:4. Genesis 6:4 is one of the weirdest verses in the entire Bible, and that's not me talking, that's the opinion of actual biblical scholars. For one thing, it is rather strangely and somewhat randomly sandwiched in between the long genealogies of Adam's descendants and right at the beginning of the famous Noah's flood story. Genesis chapter 6 verse 1 through 4 reads, "When people began to multiply on the face of the ground, and daughters were born to them, the sons of God saw they were fair, and took wives of themselves for all that they chose. Then the Lord said, My spirit shall not abide in mortals forever, for they are flesh, their days shall be 120 years. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterward, when the sons of God went to the daughters of humans, who bore children to them. These were the heroes that were of old, warriors of renown." Genesis 6:5 then abruptly changes the subject, and talks about how God saw the wickedness of humanity and decides to flood the earth, killing his creation, save Noah, his family, and some animals. And I think most of us know what happens from there. So, what are we to make of these verses? Well, for starters, we can see that the Nephilim continue to be associated with heroic warriors, as their name suggests. They appear to have been given the epithet or nickname, heroes or mighty men of old, men or warriors of renown. The Nephilim appear to be like Hercules or Achilles or Gilgamesh to the ancient Hebrews, heroes from a bygone age that according to the text seems to suggest existed before and slightly after the Great Flood that God sent to kill off almost all of humanity. Genesis 6:3, in which God claims no human shall live past 120 years old, seems again to be kind of random and interrupts the flow of Genesis 1-2 and Genesis 4. However, it might suggest that these Nephilim might have achieved long lifespans and ages that are no longer attainable in the modern day. after the flood, in which the author is writing. If we look at the ages given by the Bible for pre-flood humans, they are consistently in the hundreds. Adam lives for 930 years old. Methuselah, Noah's grandfather, lives for 969. Lamech, Noah's father, lives 777 years old. And Enoch lives for 365 years old, but technically never dies, but that's a story for another day. This idea that humans that dwelled before the Great Flood, in this mythic antediluvian age, lived for much longer lives compared to those after is in fact a belief that the Bible and other ancient religious texts of the region, specifically the Sumerian king list, the Epic of Gilgamesh, and writings of Berosus share. Among other things, this further illustrates the point that we discussed in my Leviathan video, that the early Hebrews had a lot in common religiously with the Sumerians, Babylonians, and other cultures of the region. Perhaps the most important detail we can gather about the Nephilim here is that they are the offspring, or to put it more bluntly, the product of sex between the daughters of men or humans, and perhaps more perplexingly, the sons of God. Keep this in the back of your mind because we will return to this in a little bit. Now, it might be important to note that Genesis and the Pentateuch in general were not written by one author, typically ascribed by tradition to Moses, but by several. The work of many diligent scholars has revealed that Genesis was written by several independent authors with their own unique diction, grammar, and writing styles, as well as interpretations, and this widely accepted explanation among scholars is called the documentary hypothesis. The doc hypothesis provides evidence for at the very least 4 different authors, D, E, P, and J. Nephilim in Genesis 6:4 appears to have been written by the author known as P, or the priestly source. This author is probably most distinguishable from his primary counterpart J, or the Yahweh source, due to, among other things, the word he uses for the name of God. He always uses El, or Elohim, while J always uses Yahweh instead. In Genesis, especially in Genesis 6, it appears these two authors flip back and forth almost constantly, with P telling a story in his own way, while J tells the same if not identical story in his own, with slight variations between the two. This is probably the reason why there are duplications of almost everything in Genesis, namely 2 creation stories. What is happening here is the work of 2, and sometimes more, different authors' works are being merged together or interspliced and mixed with one another, resulting in the Bible we know today. The Bible was a collaborative effort, and the Old Testament appears to have been constructed in a manner similar to the Gospels, where different authors contributed their own message as opposed to one singular one by the name of Moses. Anyways, the reason I mention the documentary hypothesis here is that these multiple authors might be the reason why the text appears to jolt back and forth, sometimes drastically from one thing to another, and I think it's important to keep in the back of our minds when discussing the Pentateuch, or the first 5 books of the Bible, as it allows us to accept when things don't properly or perfectly mesh together, or when we encounter a bit of a contradiction. Professor Richard Elliott Friedman's Who Wrote the Bible is a great book if you want to learn more about the subject. We'll return to Genesis 6 and the sons of God in a little bit, but let us first move on to the next mention of the Nephilim. The Nephilim are absent for a whole 3 books, and then out of nowhere reappear in the book of Numbers. So to set the stage, Moses and the Jewish people have escaped slavery from Egypt, as described in Exodus, and after receiving the 10 Commandments and wandering the desert for 40 years, they are just about ready to enter into and take their promised land, Canaan, modern-day Israel, Palestine. The Lord said to Moses, "Send men to spy out the land of Canaan, which I am giving to the Israelites." So they went up and spied out the land, and they told him, "Yet the people who live in the land are strong, and the towns are fortified and very large. And besides, we saw the descendants of Enoch there." So they brought to the Israelites an unfavorable report of the land that they spied out, saying, "The land that we have gone through as spies is a land that devours its inhabitants, and all the people that they saw in it are of great size. There we saw the Nephilim, the Anakites come from the Nephilim, and to ourselves we seemed like grasshoppers, and so we seemed to them." So in this text, we learn quite a lot about the Nephilim. We learn that not only did they appear to have survived the Great Flood of Genesis, but their descendants, perhaps watered-down versions of the pre-flood Nephilim, inhabited the land of Canaan, the Jewish Holy Land, before the Jewish conquest of the region. These Nephilim are also giants, huge and strong men of ginormous proportions. It is unclear how big the Nephilim are, but they are large enough to be a huge intimidation. And they also are said to eat people. It is unclear what happened to the Nephilim, as they don't appear to be referenced explicitly after Numbers 13. But we can assume that they perished or were killed in battle or something during the Israelites' conquest of Canaan, as the region the Nephilim inhabited later became Israel, and they don't inhabit it anymore. This description of the Nephilim as giants seems to reflect back on them being great and mighty warriors and fighters. A possible final reference to the Nephilim is all the way in Ezekiel 32:27. Ezekiel 32 discusses death and afterlife in the Hebrew religion. Now, the reason I say possible reference is because there appears to be two versions of Ezekiel 32:27 floating around. The Masoretic text, or MT version, and the Septuagint, or LXX, or Old Greek version. Now, the Masoretic text is what the Old Testament and most Christian Bibles, specifically the King James translation and its derivatives, and the American Standard Version, are based off of, and translated from. The MT was copied and translated by a sect of Jews in the 7th to 10th centuries CE or AD. The Septuagint text is a Greek translation of ancient Hebrew text translated in the mid-3rd and 2nd centuries BCE, LXX being slightly older than the MT version. The reason I bring up these two translations of the Bible is because LXX and MT possess drastically different versions of Ezekiel 32:27. The Masoretic text, and the version that has ended up in most Christian Bibles, reads like this: "But they do not lie with the fallen warriors of old, who went down to the realm of the dead with their weapons of war, their swords placed on their heads, and their shields resting on their bones, though these warriors also had terrorized the land of the living." The Septuagint version reads like this: "They lie with the warriors, the Nephilim of old, who descended to Sheol with their weapons of war. They placed their swords beneath their heads and their shields upon their bones, for the terror of the warriors was upon the land of the living." One says the descendants of one of Noah's sons, who died in battle uncircumcised, do not lie with fallen warriors in the Jewish realm of the dead or Sheol, while the other, older text claims they do. Modern biblical scholars almost unanimously agree that the MT version, the version in most Bibles, is mistaken, and the original text should read like LXX does. If this is the case, we have yet another last appearance of the Nephilim. Yet again, the Nephilim are described as fallen or slain warriors of old, the bygone days. The Nephilim now dwell in Sheol alongside other warriors who died in battle. Sheol, in the ancient Hebrew religion, is understood to be neither heaven or hell by biblical scholars. Rather, Sheol has much more in common with the Greek Hades or underworld, and in Ezekiel it seems like Sheol is most similar to the realm of Elysium in the Greek underworld. Elysium is a location in the afterlife reserved for the souls of great warriors and heroes, which seems similar to what the author is describing, a special location in the afterlife for warriors throughout history, the Nephilim named among them. For any more references to the Nephilim, we need to look at Hebrew text outside of the canonical Bible. The Dead Sea Scrolls, a collection of ancient Hebrew texts dating around 400 BCE to 300 CE, are a mix of manuscripts, many of them being the oldest surviving copies of biblical texts like Genesis, Deuteronomy, etc. Around 40% of these texts are copies of the biblical text. However, mixed in with these books are non-canonical books. Books ancient Hebrews read and likely valued just as much as some of the other books that are in the Bible, but eventually fell out of favor and thus were removed from the canon, and didn't end up in the Bible we have today. One of these non-canonical books is the Book of Enoch. The Book of Enoch is centuries younger than Genesis, Numbers, and Ezekiel, dating around the 300s BCE, so its relevance to these ancient texts might be a little different. The book expands on the Nephilim extensively. The Nephilim are said to be the descendants of the Watchers, or angels and humans. There is another text of the Dead Sea Scrolls written around 100 BCE called the Book of Giants, which seems to be a bit of a sequel to the Book of Enoch. Much of the same information given in the Book of Enoch is repeated in Giants. One of the interesting bits of information is that a few Nephilim are named: the Sumerian hero and king Gilgamesh, and the mythical giant intestine monster Humbaba, both legendary sort of demigods from the ancient Sumerian story, the Epic of Gilgamesh, are named as Nephilim or giants that existed before the great Noah's flood. And that's about all the information we are given about the Nephilim from ancient Hebrew sources. And from these texts we can say quite a lot about the Nephilim, which I will list out. So, firstly, and most importantly, we know they are in the older texts the hybrid offspring of the sons of God and female humans, or, according to more recent non-canonical texts, the offspring of angels and female humans. We also know they were giant, legendary, heroic, and mighty warriors, likely akin to Achilles or Gilgamesh, that have fallen or were killed in battle. They belong to a distant, bygone period of Hebrew history, before the flood and before Israel's founding. The Nephilim are associated with a heroic death and warfare, and dwelled in the Hebrew afterlife of Sheol, with other warriors in history, namely those who were uncircumcised, in a manner similar to Elysium in Greek mythology, and maybe even Valhalla in Norse mythology. The Nephilim in non-canonical sources are associated with demigods and legendary mythical characters from neighboring polytheistic religions, such as the Mesopotamian religion. Now, the picture that is starting to build in accordance to the textual evidence is that the Nephilim to ancient Hebrews were legendary demigod-like heroes that existed, fought, and achieved a type of status in the past, but are now no longer. I think the Nephilim might have been very similar to demigod figures that achieved greatness in their lives in the respective religions of the Hebrews' contemporaries, like Hercules, Perseus, Jason, and Achilles in Greek mythology, or Gilgamesh in Sumerian mythology. It seems the ancient Hebrews' neighbors all believed in heroic men of divine origin, achieving greatness in the past, and the Hebrew authors were simply acknowledging and incorporating these foreign myths and beliefs into the Bible, and making their own Hebrew version of these figures, much like what happened to Leviathan. And the evidence and the scholarly consensus supports this conclusion. But I know what you're going to say. Isn't Judaism, and by proxy the Bible itself, monotheistic, having one God? So wouldn't that mean the existence of demigods and sons of God contradict this point and seemingly suggest Judaism isn't monotheistic after all? Well, to address your question, the real key to understanding the Nephilim is understanding their fathers, the sons of God referenced in Genesis 6, as well as the origins and development of the Hebrew religion. Part 2. Sons of God. I think the first step to understanding who the sons of God are is to look at the phrase itself. The Hebrew words used here is ben Elohim, and is often translated to the sons of God. But this might actually be a mistranslation, because the curious thing is that word used for God in the phrase is plural, Elohim, and not singular, El. It should be translated as gods, lowercase, not gods, singular, uppercase. So a more accurate and literal translation would be the sons of the gods, and not sons of God. As we have discussed earlier, God is called by many names in the Hebrew Bible, sometimes Yahweh, sometimes El, and sometimes as a plural, Elohim. Now, you Christians that will claim this is evidence of the Trinity, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, a much later belief not held by modern or even ancient Jews, hold your horses. Elohim is used interchangeably to describe both the Hebrew creator God, as in Genesis, and the non-specific polytheistic gods of other nations, such as Exodus 12:12. Against all the gods, Elohim, of Egypt, I will execute judgment. I am the Lord, Yahweh. Or in Genesis 35:2, put away the strange gods, Elohim, that are among you. And it is even used to refer to Adam and Eve, if they eat the forbidden fruit, as they will become gods. Genesis 3:5. For God doth know that in the day you eat thereof, then your eyes shall be opened, and you shall be as gods, Elohim, knowing good and evil. Therefore, the first lines of the Bible should really read from a literal translation like this. In the beginning, the gods, Elohim, created the heavens and the earth. And the passage in Genesis 6 should read, the sons of the gods. Perplexingly as this may be, keep this in the back of your mind for the moment, because we'll come back to it. The sons of the gods, or God, appear in other locations in the Old Testament, namely in Genesis 1:6. Now there was a day when the sons of God, ben Elohim, came to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan came also among them. In this passage, these sons of God or gods appear in a divine court or meeting around Yahweh, and Satan appears to be interestingly among them as one of these sons. Now, if you look at your traditional Bible, this is the last mention of these sons of God, or gods, in the Old Testament. However, just like with Ezekiel 32:27, there are multiple versions or textual variants of the same verse that have drastically different meanings depending on which text/translation you are looking at. Deuteronomy 32:8 in your average King James or American Standard Bible, based off of the Masoretic text, reads like this: When the Most High gave the nations their inheritance, when he divided all the sons of man, he set the boundaries of the peoples according to the number of sons of Israel. For Yahweh's portion was his people. Jacob was the lot of his inheritance. However, we in fact have many textual variants of this verse in particular. Firstly, the chronologically older translation, copies of the Septuagint or LXX version of Deuteronomy 32:8, most commonly read like this: When the Most High divided the nations, when he separated the sons of Adam, he set the boundaries of the nations according to the number of angels of God. And his people, Jacob, became the portion of the Lord. Israel was the line of his inheritance. If you notice, the sons of Israel in this version has been replaced with the angels of God, a vastly different translation, and obviously not a mistake. Most interestingly of all, there are some versions of LXX that do not say angels of God or even sons of Israel, but the sons of the gods, or sons of God. To make it even more interesting, when archaeologists discovered the Dead Sea Scrolls, they discovered the oldest surviving copies of the Deuteronomy text. The texts are relatively identical to LXX in the MT translation. However, in this verse, Deuteronomy 32:8 in particular, we have two different ancient copies that read like this. When Elyon gave the nations as an inheritance, when he separated the sons of man, he set the boundaries of the peoples according to the number of sons of God, Ben Elohim. For Yahweh's portion was his people, Jacob was the lot of his inheritance. What the heck is going on here? Well, it appears the text changed meaning in simply just this single phrase the further you go back and the closer you get to the original Hebrew authors. The text appears to have been originally sons of God or gods, but was gradually altered over time to angels and then to sons of Israel, humans. It's certainly weird and curious, and it seems we have a bit of a cover-up going on here. Why were translators so concerned with this single phrase? Well, it makes sense when you look at the meaning of the verse. The author is claiming that the Most High, Elyon, divided the world into nations in accordance to the number of sons of Elohim. Yahweh, the Jewish God's portion, is the Jewish peoples, Israel. Yahweh in this passage seems to be a distinct entity from El, the Most High, and it is highly implied that Yahweh is one of the sons of the gods, or God, rather than God himself. More interestingly, if we look at the number of nations in which the world was believed to be divided into in Genesis 10, or the generations of Noah, or the Table of Nations, the number of names and therefore nations given is 70. This number of 70 nations directly correlates to a concept in the Canaanite religion, the primary neighboring religion of the ancient Hebrews. In the Canaanite religion, the world was divided amongst the sons of the supreme god El and his goddess wife Asherah. And the number of these sons? 70, with each nation belonging to a corresponding son of God. Greece was given to Zeus, Babylon was given to Marduk, Assyria was given to Asher, and of course Israel was given to Yahweh. It is an undoubtedly polytheistic message. Yahweh, the Jewish God, isn't the supreme God, but a son of the Most High, and Israel is simply one nation that corresponds to this God, with the other nations each having their own respective son of the Most High, or their own God that they worship. An alternative interpretation by Professor Richard Friedman, given in his book The Exodus, is that Yahweh is the highest God and did divide it among his sons, Marduk, Asher, etc., but kept Israel for himself, rather than El and Yahweh being different entities. Regardless, the message stays the same. In the ancient Hebrew religion, other gods exist, and the sons of Elohim are the gods of other nations. Although most translators and modern believers tend to see these sons of God as angels, this does not seem to be the case in the original meaning of the text. As Professor John Day puts it in his book, Yahweh and the Other Gods and Goddesses of Canaan, originally these were gods, but as monotheism became absolute, so they were demoted to the status of angels. It appears that Judaism and the Bible in its ancient and original state was not fully monotheistic, but was somewhat polytheistic and was still connected to the religion of the Canaanites. It was only later changes and revisions that appear to have altered and removed evidence of these polytheistic references. There are other hints here and there of polytheism in the Pentateuch, and it makes you really rethink verses like Exodus 12:12. On that same night I will pass through Egypt and strike down every firstborn, both people and animal. And I will bring forth judgment on all the gods of Egypt. I am the Lord. And Exodus 15:11. Who is like you among the gods, Yahweh? It also makes one think about the reason why the Creator God was plural in Genesis. Psalms 82, or what Professor Richard Elliott Friedman dubs the myth of the death of God, says, God is standing in the divine assembly. He judges among the gods. I said, you are gods and the children of the highest, or sons of the Most High, all of you. But like a human you will die, and like one of the rulers you will fall. The author of Psalm 82 claims that Yahweh is the highest among the gods, which exist, but condemns all of these gods to death like mere mortals, leaving only him, the death of the other gods. My apologies if this sounds like this is going off the deep end, but all you need to know is that these texts and verses strongly suggest that early Judaism and the biblical authors themselves believed in a version of Judaism slightly different than the versions believed today. This version of Judaism seems to have been partially polytheistic, if not polytheistic. The existence of other gods was not denied, rather they existed, but either Yahweh was among them, or the most powerful one, or their father. This is something called monolatry, and it is likely what the biblical authors and ancient Jews believed in. Yahweh or El wasn't the only god in existence, but there were many other gods, such as Asherah, El or Yahweh's sons, and the countless gods of neighboring nations, an entire pantheon. But it appears this original initial belief in partial polytheism in Judaism was either gradually or rapidly replaced with full-on monotheism we know today. The existence of other gods beside El Yahweh was denied, and text and traditions were changed and altered. As the textual variations of Deuteronomy 32:8 reflect, the other gods were demoted to the level of angels and attempted to be edited out entirely. How exactly Yahweh became the only god in existence is complex and perhaps a story for a better day, as this video is already long enough, so for now let's get back to the sons of God and the Nephilim that started this whole thing. So what are the Nephilim and the sons of God? Well, the Nephilim are likely Hebrew demigods, similar to Hercules and Achilles in Greek mythology. Heroic men created through the sexual union of women and the sons of God. These sons of God, or gods, are not exactly angels or demons, but gods themselves, the sons of El and Asherah, a female goddess. The passage and similar passages that seem to suggest the existence of other gods reflect early Judaism's relationship with the pre-existing polytheistic religions, most notably the religions of the Canaanites, Babylonians, and Greeks. At some point in history, these references were attempted to be edited out or altered to avoid Judaism's association with polytheism. However, their traces remained, and some texts from this ancient period in history survived, such as the Dead Sea Scrolls, preserving Judaism's polytheistic leanings. To best put it, the Nephilim and the sons of God are vestigial remnants of a different kind of Judaism than the modern Abrahamic faiths we are familiar with. They are like the Leviathan, a carryover from an older age, and an older religion, a time when there was not God, but gods in Israel. And with that, thank you so much for watching this installment of Trey the Explainer. Sorry if this one was a little much. Like the Leviathan video, this one was a lot. I've been working for years on this script and done a lot of reading. I mean, a lot of reading on the subject. And to top it all off, this time I actually contacted the real biblical scholars on the subject. I emailed Professors Mark S. Smith, Richard Friedman, and John Day about this video idea, and all of them gave me help and sources for it, which was awesome. I just wanted to thank them for all their awesome help, and I want to thank Professor John Day specifically for helping me out with the script of this video, and making sure I didn't make any errors. I was ecstatic to work with these people who actually did the research I was discussing. That's simply amazing. Anyways, I hope you enjoyed this topic and learned something new, as it was truly fascinating for me to learn about. Leave me some suggestions for future videos. I'm so sorry, prehistoric people. I'll get back to my roots in next video. Yeah, next video. Hope you have a great day, and I'll see you next time. So fine, so young. Tell me I'm the only one. Babylon sisters, shake it.